Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone. Best wishes. May we always be given health during this pandemic. Let me introduce myself. My name is Bunga. I'm majoring in economic education with third ID number 1710161716 and 6. In this video, I will present my thesis proposal entitled The Influence of Learning Motivation, Interest in Learning, and Online Learning Media on Student Learning Outcomes in Economic Subjects. My background on tackling the problem is, in early March 2020, Indonesia confirmed the first case of infection with the COVID-19 virus. Due to the virus, the education system in Indonesia was forced to change, which initially used a face-to-face system and eventually had to use online system or study from home. The learning process must still be carried out in every formal education. Belajar High School Jakarta requires every teacher to do online learning. Research conducted interviews and direct observation when carrying out teaching activities practice at 105 High School, Jakarta. In class 10, social studies in economics, that there were student learning outcomes that were still below the minimum competence criteria. It can be seen that the average value of end semester assessment in 3 class ABC during the distance learning is too low. If the 3 classes are average, they only get a score of 63.89, when the minimum competence criteria score is 70. In this problem, it seems that there are problems with students during economics learning. So with that, I conducted interviews with 15 students representing class 10 social science A, B, C. I asked what were the obstacles when learning economics took place. The result of the interview stated that 7 children answered that there was no motivation to learn because they were bored during this online learning. Then, 4 children answered that there was no interest in studying economics because of the math material and also the decreased interest in learning due to distance learning. The next factor, 4 children answered that the learning media do sometimes experience error. For example, when learning took place using Google Meet, there were some who left the Google Meet application without knowing the reason. And there were also some who experienced error in their Google Classroom due to the absence of notification which caused students to miss information. As on the description, it can be drawn the formulation of the research problem. First, is there a direct influence of interest in learning on the learning motivation of class 10 social science student at 105 High School? Second, is there a direct influence of online learning media on the learning motivation of class 10 social science student at 05 High School? Third, is there a direct influence of learning motivation on student learning outcomes in class 10 social science 105 High School? Fourth, is there a direct influence of interest in learning on student learning outcomes in class 10 social science 105 High School? 5. Is there a direct influence of learning media on student learning outcomes in class 10 social science 105 High School? 6. Is there an indirect effect of interest in learning on the learning outcomes of class 10 social science 105 school student through learning motivation? And last, is there an indirect effect of online learning media on the learning outcomes of class 10 social student at 05 high school through learning motivation? According to Amoli, 2008, learning outcomes are the occurrence of change in behavior in a person who can be observed and measured in the form of knowledge, attitudes, and skills. This change can be interpreted as the occurrence of improvements and development that were better before those who did not know become known. The same thing was expressed by Sujatna, 2010. The student learning outcomes are essentially changes in behavior that have occurred through the learning process. Changes in behavior are in the form of student ability after learning activities that become the result of learning outcomes. Well, the definition of interest according to Crow and Crow 19 of 28 is defined as a driving force that causes individuals to pay attention to someone or to certain activities. H.U. with the ringtone, in his book Educational Psychology, defines interest as a person's awareness that an object, person, problem, and situation has something to do with him. Then, according to the Association for Education and Communication Technology, defines media as objects that can be manipulated, seen, heard, read, or discussed, along with instruments that are used properly in teaching and learning activities, which can affect the effectiveness of instructional programs. And the teaching media, according to Narashodi, 2003, is defined as everything that can be used to channel messages or listen content, stimulate student through feelings, attention, abilities, so that they can encourage the teaching and learning process. About online learning media, actually the principle of online is the same as in other media. The teaching and learning process in learning can be done by anyone, anywhere, and anytime. To support learning activities, an online-based learning media is needed. E-learning is done through web-based internet intermediary media. For example, Google Meet and Google Classroom, which can be accessed for successful learning activities. This research has several journals or research that are relevant to the variables to be studied. The first was a study conducted by Novianti, Sadipun, and Balan in the year 2020, entitled The Influence of Learning Motivation on Student Mathematics Learning Outcomes. The result of the study concluded that hypothesis testing obtained, meaning that there was a significant influence between learning motivation on mathematics learning outcomes for grade 3, 4, 5 in ND11 primary school. The second, research conducted by Lestari in the year 2017, entitled The Influence of Early Mathematics Ability and Learning Motivation on Mathematics Learning Outcomes. From the research hypothesis testing, it means that there is a positive influence of learning motivation on student mathematics learning outcomes. From hypothesis testing, the value of t count is greater than stable, so that H0 is rejected and H1 is expected, which means that there is a positive influence on initially ability and motivation to learn together on student mathematics learning outcomes. Third, research conducted by Laras and Rifai in the year 2019, entitled The Influence of Interest and Learning Motivation on Student Learning Outcomes and BBPLK Semarang. The result, it can be concluded that H0 is rejected, in other words, that there is a significant influence between interest and learning motivation on student learning outcomes in participating in training and BBPLK Semarang. Lastly, the research conducted by Setiorini and Wulandari in the year 2021 entitled The Influence of Learning Media, Facilities, and Learning Environment on Learning Outcomes during the COVID-19 pandemic. The result of previous study state that judging from the result of the test data on the hypothesis test above, there was a significant influence between learning media on student learning outcomes during the COVID-19 pandemic. There is a theory about the influence of interest in learning on learning motivation. Interest in learning is the urge that a person has to carry out learning activities. Holly argues that students who have a high interest in learning will do more activities and faster, compared to students who are less motivated in learning. So with that, if students already have a high interest in learning, then the motivation to learn is also growing. Second, a theory about the influence of learning media on learning motivation. Learning media can fulfill three main functions if the media is used for individuals, groups, or large groups, namely 1. Motivating interest or action, 2. Representing information, 3. Giving instruction. The increase in learning media will be followed by an increase in learning motivation. It is supported by research Yulia and Minat at 2017, which show that learning media has a positive effect of student learning motivation, which means that if the level of use the learning media decreases or is less, the level of learning motivation will decrease. Third is theory about the influence of learning motivation on learning outcomes. Namely, according to Slameto, in the year 2010, factors that affect learning outcomes that come from internal factors and external factors. One of the internal factors is learning motivation. And also, Clayton Aldefer stated that high learning motivation tends to produce high learning outcomes, whereas low learning motivation will produce low learning outcomes. Fourth, there is a theory about the effect of interest in learning on learning outcomes. According to Slameto, in the year 2010, factors that influence learning outcomes that come from internal and external factors. One of the internal factors is interest. Howley also argues that students who have a high interest in learning will do more and faster activities, compared to students who have less and respect to learning. 5. Theory about the influence of learning media on learning outcomes. According to Slameto, in the year 2010, the factor of influence learning outcomes come from internal factors and external factors. One of the external factors is learning media that come from school factors. Sixth theory about the effect of interest in learning on learning outcomes through learning motivation. Interest in learning is the urge that a person to carry out learning activities. Howley argues that students who have a high interest in learning will do more activities and faster, compared to students who are less motivated in learning. Interest learning will form a person's motivation to learning. So, with that, achievement will be better if you have interest in learning. And last theory about the influence of learning media on learning outcomes through learning motivation. Learning media can fulfill three main functions if the media is used for individuals, groups, or large groups, namely 1. Motivating interest or action, 2. Representing information, 3. Giving instruction. The use of learning media in the teaching and learning process can be generated using desire and interest. Generate motivation and stimulation of learning activities, and even bring psychological effect on students. The increase in learning media will be followed by an increase in learning motivation. So with that, increase in learning media will also help improve student learning outcomes. Based on the literature review and the theoretical framework that has been put forward, hypotheses can be proposed, namely 1. Interest in learning affects learning motivation. 2. Online learning media has an effect on learning motivation. 3. Learning motivation affects learning outcomes. 4. Interest in learning affects learning outcomes. 5. Online learning media affect learning outcomes. 6. Interest in learning affect learning outcomes through learning motivation. 7. Media online learning affects the learning outcomes through learning motivation. This research was conducted at 10 Social Science ABC 1055 High School, Jakarta, which is located at Jalan Raya Ciracas, RT 1 and 4, Kelapa 2 Wetan, Kecamatan Ciracas, East Jakarta City, Special Capital Region of Jakarta. The time of this research was carried out starting from May 2021. This research is quantitative research. This type of research is causality research, which is research designed to examine the possibility of a cause and effect relationship between variables. The data used in our research variable the primary data and secondary data. The population in this study were students of Class 10 Social Science 105 High School, Jakarta, amounting to 120 students. In taking the sample, the research used a saturated sampling technique, which meant that the sample in the study was 120 students of Class 10 Social Science 105 High School, Jakarta. Sources of data used in the study are primary and secondary data sources. This data was obtained from the distribution of questionnaires given to all students of Class 10 Social Science 105 High School, Jakarta. In this study, secondary data used is data or documenting of the grade 10 social studies student at 105 High School, Jakarta in economic subjects. Data collection in this study was carried out using survey methods or questionnaire distribution and documenting. The data collection technique for the independent variable was using questionnaire distribution by scoring using a Likert scale. Data analysis technique in this study was carried out using path analysis. Well, I think that's enough information about the content of my research proposal. Sorry if there is any mistake. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.